Very significant market, long-term relationships there. Anything that would impact that is obviously of huge concern.
As Canada stares down 35% tariffs from the United States set to come into effect Friday, one Montreal think tank suggests Canada might benefit from dropping all tariffs unilaterally.
We've taken to calling it the Trump tariff tax because at the end of the day, the end user pays for all of the input costs along the way for these products.
We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada. I think Canada could be one where they'll just pay tariffs.
The humble potato, a staple crop synonymous with North American agriculture, has become an unlikely indicator of more profound economic shifts between Canada and the United States. For the fourth consecutive month in 2025, Canadian potato exports to the U.S. have declined, with over 140,000 tons no longer crossing the border in a single quarter. This significant drop, representing a 40% reduction from 2024's export volume of 350,000 metric tons, is not just a statistic. It's a signal that the supply chain is falling out of sync. The question looms: is this a temporary disruption, or does it herald a new phase in the economic relationship between these two neighboring nations? The implications extend beyond agriculture, potentially affecting meat, grains, and the broader global supply chain. This analysis examines the causes, consequences, and wider context of this shift, drawing on publicly available data and industry perspectives to stimulate reflection. In 2024, Canada exported over 350,000 metric tons of potatoes to the U.S., equivalent to roughly 17,500 refrigerated containers, each carrying 20 tons. This volume highlights the long-standing trade relationship between the two countries, with potatoes playing a pivotal role in cross-border commerce. By the second quarter of 2025, however, exports have plummeted by more than 40%. To put this in perspective, the 140,000 tons no longer reaching the U.S. could have supplied over 17 million American households based on an average annual consumption of 45 pounds per household. This loss is enough to cover the entire northern U.S. market, leaving a noticeable gap in supply. The decline is not the result of an official policy change or export ban from Ottawa. Instead, it appears as a quiet, unannounced contraction. Processing companies are scaling back contracts, farmers are adjusting planting plans, and supply chains are idling. Warehouses that once bustled with activity now sit silent, with cold storage units gradually going dark. This cautious retreat suggests a structural shift driven by economic pressures rather than explicit government directives. The most immediate cause of this disruption lies across the border. On April 2, 2025, dubbed Trade Liberation Day by some U.S. media outlets, the U.S. government implemented a sweeping new tariff schedule on all imported goods. April 2nd, reciprocal tariffs kick in, and whenever they tariff us, other countries, we will tariff them. That's reciprocal back and forth. For Canadian potatoes, this meant a 25% tariff on fresh, seed, and frozen varieties, layered on top of a baseline 10% import duty. The combined effect pushes the effective duty to as high as 35%, increasing the cost per pound by 8 to 12 cents, depending on the potato variety. For a 25-ton shipment of frozen French fries, previously valued at $32,000, the added import cost now reaches up to $11,200. This translates to a retail price hike, with a 50-pound bag of potatoes jumping from $22 to $28 to $30, a nearly 35% increase in a single quarter. For U.S. consumers, the impact is immediate. A serving of French fries that once cost $3.50 now approaches $5.25. Restaurants facing shrinking margins are forced to adjust menus, reduce portion sizes, or pass costs on to customers. The $10 that once bought nearly 3 servings of fries now covers just 1.5. This price shock reverberates through the agricultural value chain, affecting processors, distributors, and farmers on both sides of the border. American importers grappling with higher costs are scaling back orders or switching to domestic potatoes. Even if quality and processing efficiency don't always match Canadian standards, this shift directly impacts Canadian processors like McCain and Cavendish, who rely heavily on the U.S. market. In response, these companies have reduced raw potato contracts, prompting farmers in Canada's top potato growing regions, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Alberta, to scale back planting for the 2025 season. Industry sources estimate that yields at mid-size farms may drop by 15 to 25% due to decreased demand, not a lack of land or labor. In the U.S., the transition to domestic supply is not seamless. A Minnesota restaurant owner reported that his Canadian potato supplier halted deliveries in April 2025 due to the 25% tariff, forcing him to switch to domestic potatoes that are 25% more expensive and lower in quality. The result? Soggy, oily fries that have driven customer complaints and a drop in revenue. Food distributors in states like North Dakota and Wisconsin, once reliant on Canadian supply, are renegotiating contracts with American farms. Some halting potato distribution entirely due to quality and cost issues. Even large chains like McDonald's and Wendy's face pressure as suppliers struggle to maintain pre-tariff pricing. The entire supply chain from processing plants to dinner plates is squeezed by rising input costs and consumer resistance to higher prices for a staple expected to remain affordable. American growers, particularly in Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, may see short-term relief from reduced Canadian competition, with farm gate potato prices rising from 6.5 cents to 8.2 cents per pound. However, their input costs, fertilizer, pesticides, and fuel, much of which is imported via Canada, are also subject to the 25% tariff, increasing production costs by 15 to 18% in Q2, 2025. A gallon of diesel for farming machinery, for instance, has climbed from $4.80 to over $6. As a result, net margins for U.S. farmers remain flat or slightly decline after operating expenses. Additionally, U.S. potato exports to Canada and Mexico, which account for 20% of output, face reciprocal trade frictions, raising concerns about domestic oversupply and downward pressure on prices. In Canada, the decline in U.S. exports is not just a loss but a potential pivot point. In Prince Edward Island, where over 65% of potato production typically serves the U.S., farmers are shifting to domestic markets or shorter supply chains. Instead of bulk containers for export, many are now packaging potatoes in 5-kilo retail bags for local supermarkets. This increases the value per pound and supports small-scale processing and packaging operations in rural communities. For Canadian consumers, the reduced export volume stabilizes domestic supply, cushioning the blow from broader supply chain disruptions. A 5-pound bag of fresh potatoes, which once sold for $4.99 Canadian, now hovers around $4.50 to $4.99, avoiding the sharp price spikes seen in red meat or imported grains. Surplus potatoes are also being diverted to local food programs, food banks, and community kitchens in regions like New Brunswick and Manitoba. Initiatives to buy excess potatoes at subsidized prices for low-income households are gaining traction. For a family, saving $5 a week on locally grown potatoes could fund additional staples like milk, eggs, or bread, which are also affected by inflation. In today's economic climate, these small savings are significant. More broadly, Canada is re-evaluating its reliance on the U.S. market, where over 92% of its potato exports traditionally flow. Since late 2024, trade delegations have targeted new markets in Asia and beyond, including Indonesia, the Philippines, and Panama. Prime Minister Carney's $1.6 billion agricultural trade deal signed in 2025 focuses on processed goods and premium products. With Japan, South Korea, and Indonesia emerging as key partners, Japan is expanding its market for Canadian frozen French fries through companies like McCain. While Indonesia, with its 275 million strong population, imported $8 million worth of fresh potatoes from Prince Edward Island in 2024, Thailand has become Canada's largest non-North American importer, purchasing over $4 million in fresh and seed potatoes, with Caribbean markets like Trinidad and Tobago and Panama, each importing over $13 million. This diversification is reshaping Canada's agricultural landscape. In Charlottetown, a freezing plant recently added a new processing line for Japanese clients, creating 45 full-time jobs and increasing local potato purchases by 15%. A family farm in Summerside noted that new outlets for lower-grade potatoes, which were previously discarded or fed to livestock, are now reducing food waste and boosting incomes. This shift toward a broader, more resilient export ecosystem is reducing Canada's vulnerability to disruptions in a single market. The pivot to Asia, while promising, is not without challenges. South Korea remains closed to fresh Canadian potatoes due to quarantine regulations and logistics to Asia. High shipping costs, strict quarantine processes, and infrastructure mismatches pose significant barriers. Canada's reliance on large corporations like McCain to establish new supply chains may limit benefits for small-scale farmers in the short term. Moreover, the Asian market is unlikely to fully replace the United States in scale or proximity. Instead, it offers Canada more options, leverage, and autonomy in an increasingly unpredictable trade landscape. The potato trade disruption is more than a niche agricultural issue. It's a microcosm of fraying economic ties between Canada and the United States. As tariffs rise, contracts shrink, and farmers scale back, the evidence of strain is clear in silent warehouses and rising prices. United States consumers face a 3% food price increase over the 12 months ending June 2025, with potatoes contributing significantly. An additional $5 to $20 per year for potatoes and processed products may seem minor, but for low-income families or retirees, it's a direct cut into daily meals. If a staple as unassuming as the potato is no longer a sure thing, well, what's next? Meat, dairy, and grains could follow, signaling a deeper fracture in North America's once steady trade framework. Canada's strategic pivot to Asia and other markets suggests a recognition that the United States is no longer the stable partner it once was. As one Canadian Potato Producers Association representative reportedly said, "We need a stable market, and the U.S. just isn't that anymore." Whether this is a temporary shock, or the start of a new economic era, the potato's plight underscores a broader truth. In today's global trade landscape, even the most reliable foundations can shift.